Afternoon, everyone. As I said earlier, thanks for coming back. Surprised to see so many faces here. Alistair this morning talked about simplifying things from James Hayes' perspective for yourselves and for your clients. Unfortunately, I work in a part of the industry where simplification is just not an option. The term pension simplification was the biggest misnomer there's ever been, and with every piece of legislation that's been introduced since then, we get further levels of complexity added to the situation, which makes it incredibly difficult for members of the public to even grasp what the hell is going on within pensions, which in turn tends to switch a lot of people off. When the idea of protection was first mooted as a subject matter for the presentation, seemed like a good idea, but as I said, legislation is incredibly complicated, and the more we delved into this topic, the more complicated it became, to the point that we were up to about 30 or 40 slides. Fortunately, I've cut it down to about 17 actual slides, but even then, some of the things within the slides I'm not really going to touch upon today. I'm just going to skim over them. You will get copies of the slides, and if you want to sort of look at them at a later date and come back to anyone in the technical support unit, myself and John Dunn, who specialise in pensions, by all means do so. Okay. Obviously, protection is very sort of much flavour of the month. We've just seen the lifetime allowance reduced to £1 million from April of this year, and currently people can apply for three forms of protection: individual protection 2014, individual protection 2016, and fixed protection. So what I want to do today is really just look at the various forms of protection that currently exist for people trying to protect their lifetime allowance, then look at the primary purpose of the session is look at what things people should try and avoid doing to retain that protection and why that's important. And then we'll look at some consequences for people who've unfortunately lost the form of protection that they maybe had in the past, okay? If you've got any questions as I'm prattling on here, by all means stop me and tell me to leave the platform if that's more appropriate. But if not, hopefully we'll get through this in the sort of next 25 to 30 minutes, okay? So types of protection. Looking very quickly at them, the two forms of protection that were available in 2006 up to 2009 were primary and enhanced protection. You're all familiar with it. You've probably got lots of clients that have got one or the other, or even both. And just very quickly summarising them, with primary protection, someone could apply for primary protection if their pension rights were in excess of 1.5 million at the 5th of April 2006. And they could also have lump sum protection as long as their lump sum rights were worth more than £375,000 at that time. Okay, I'm not going to go into how it actually works today. I've got an example in a slide or two's time that gives a little bit of that detail. And the thing with primary protection, and indeed all other forms of protection with the exception of enhanced protection, is it's irrevocable. You can't lose it from making a decision to lose it. You've actually got to do something to lose that form of protection. Whereas with enhanced protection, which was available in 2006 as well, it is possible to give it up by writing to HMRC and saying, I no longer want to rely on enhanced protection. Okay? And with enhanced protection, someone will never have a lifetime allowance charge to pay as long as it's valid. Okay? All the other forms of protection, if you exceed a certain level, then potentially you'll have that lifetime allowance charge to pay. And again, with enhanced protection, it's possible to have lump sum protection as well. In the case of enhanced protection, then the lump sum protection will be a percentage on the certificate. So something like, say, 20% on the certificate. That means whenever someone is crystallising any of their funds, they're entitled to take 20% of what they're crystallising as a PCLS, okay? So it doesn't matter whether the fund is worth 3 million or 100 million, they can still take 20%, whereas in the case of fixed protection, the lump sum is in the form of an amount stipulated on the certificate. Okay. Other forms of protection that we're again familiar with, introduced from 2012, are fixed protection and individual protection from 14 and 16. Okay, and in the case of fixed protection, you apply for it, and if you want to retain it, you can't have any further benefit accrual, which we'll pick up in a moment. All right. So again, Whilst you've got that protection, you potentially could still suffer a lifetime allowance charge if you exceed that amount. Individual protection, slightly different. Your funds have to be worth a certain amount to apply for the various forms of it, but you can continue to fund your pension once you have that protection. So there are a couple of forms of protection that I'm not going to touch on at all today. There is a lifetime enhancement factor for people who have received a pension credit from an ex-spouse where those benefits had previously been crystallised, and also where someone has accrued rights in an overseas pension that has not enjoyed any UK tax relief. Okay? And then the other forms of protection that were available in 2006 are protected pension age for people able to retire before 55, and a thing called scheme-specific lump sum protection. All right? So having covered off all of those, we're now in a situation where there is potentially 16 combinations of protection that one of your clients could have. Okay? So if we look at the sort of top left-hand side of it, you could have a client who has enhanced protection and primary protection as well. But the primary protection is dormant. In other words, it's sitting in the background and they will rely on their enhanced protection. And it's only if they lose their enhanced protection will they revert back to the dormant primary protection. All right, everyone happy with that? So 16 variations on it. Try and explain that to your clients. Okay, why is it important? Well, as I said earlier, the lifetime allowance, or the standard lifetime allowance, has been reduced to £1 million this year. But in the 15-16 tax year, the lifetime allowance charge increased as a take for HMRC by 62% to £162 million in extra revenue for HMRC in the 15-16 tax year compared to something like 70-odd thousand in the 14-15. And that is based on the fact that the lifetime allowance hadn't reduced to £1 million at that point. So we're now in a situation where we are £1 million and far more people are going to be caught by the lifetime allowance charge. So it's important, where clients potentially are going to be affected by this, that they have a form of protection, and where they have the protection, it's equally important to try and retain that protection. So looking at things that you want to avoid as a pension scheme member to retain your protection. So the first thing with respect to individual protection and primary protection is tell your clients to avoid getting a divorce. Okay? Now, I can't personally speak about primary and individual protection because I don't have it myself, but I can certainly talk to you about divorce because I've had a few of them myself. But effectively, where you have clients that are getting divorced, there's a potential risk that they would lose either their primary protection or their individual protection. And equally, where someone is in receipt of a pension credit, then care has to be taken as to what happens with that pension credit, because they in turn could lose their protection, their enhanced protection, for instance. Okay, so what does that actually mean? Let's look at an example. I apologise if the text is a bit small, but we changed the format of the slides, and what was originally quite a large text has now been sort of shrunken down slightly. But this individual, Jack, he's got no protection other than primary protection, and the value of his pension rights in April of 2006 was 1.8 million. So that means that he has an enhancement factor of 0.2. Okay, the way that works is you take 1.8 minus the 1.5, divide it by 1.5, and that gives you the 20% uplift. And because at one point, obviously, the lifetime allowance, standard lifetime allowance was 1.8 million and has subsequently come down, one of the things that the legislation allowed for was what's called the underpinned lifetime allowance for people with primary protection and enhanced protection, so retained it at 1.8. So in Jack's case, he can take up to 2.16 million of pension rights without having a lifetime allowance charge to pay. So Jack crystallised some of his benefits in November 2014, and then unfortunately in 2017, I know we're looking into the future, I hope Jack's aware of the fact he's getting a divorce in 2017, but at that point he had uncrystallised funds, and the pension credit takes away 400,000 for him. So the way it works with primary protection is it's a straight cut from what his funds were worth at the 5th of April 2006. So in other words, 1.8 take away that amount, takes him down to 1.4 million. So Jack loses his primary protection. The unfortunate thing for Jack as well is that there's a revaluation of those pension rights that he had already taken in 2014, and because of that revaluation, it means that he's actually got no lifetime allowance left either. Okay? So anything he takes from that remaining £200,000, he would suffer a lifetime allowance charge on. And then we've got another example here. I'm not going to go through it. I'll just leave you to look at that at your leisure. But this is the case for someone who has individual protection, and it's a slightly different treatment of that, the amount that's being reduced as a result of the pension debit. There's an allowance made for each complete tax year past the date of the individual protection, okay? But you can look at this in your own leisure, as I said. So that's how you would lose individual protection and primary protection, and that's really the only way that you can lose it. But the likes of the other forms of protection, i.e. fixed protection and enhanced protection, then other factors come in, and one of those is a thing called a benefit accrual. All right, and in the case of a money purchase arrangement, it's relatively straightforward. It's an input test. So in other words, if the individual makes a contribution to their pension, then that is benefit accrual, and they will lose their enhanced protection or their fixed protection, okay? And in terms of where does that contribution come from? Well, probably in most instances we're talking about a personal contribution or possibly an employer contribution. There is another one there, which is the bottom one, which is quite obscure, but potentially it's meaning if someone had a contribution made by someone other than the top two that was then subsequently allocated to them, then they would also lose their protection as a result of that. In the case of a defined benefit scheme, it's slightly more complicated, and it splits into the way it works for both fixed protection and enhanced protection, which we seem to have tweaked slightly here. Apologies, there should be a further bullet point in there that we've made a sub-bullet point. Didn't notice that this morning. Anyway, let's go back. Defined benefit cash balance, or with enhanced protection, it's an output test. So it's at the point that the individual takes their benefit that the test is done, or where there's a transfer from one pension arrangement to another. So someone transferring from a DB scheme, final salary scheme, into a money purchase arrangement with enhanced protection, there's a test to see if there's any benefit accrual at that point. Okay, and what we're looking at is a thing called the appropriate limit, and there's two ways of calculating that, and it's the greater of the two. The first one is the indexed option. That's relatively straightforward. You're just looking at an increase on the rights from the 5th of April 2006, indexed up by 5% or RPI. In the case of earnings recalculation, it's the increase in their earnings from, again, the 5th of April 2006 to the point that they're taking their benefits. If you're familiar with the pension tax manual, there is an example in there that explains it in quite good detail, and if you want to follow that through, you'll see how that works. What you're doing, though, is you're looking at that from which is the greater of the amount in terms of that value that's calculated, and if the transfer value is within those parameters, then there's no benefit accrual deemed to have taken place, and I'll pick that up again in a minute. The next point should have been a major bullet point, but in the case of fixed protection, it's an ongoing test rather than an output test. So that means someone who has enhanced protection should be looking, and fixed protection should be looking at how much benefit is accruing within their pension on an ongoing basis. So in theory, they should be checking it every minute of the day. But the reality of it is obviously nobody's ever going to do that. But in principle, someone should be looking to make sure that they haven't had any benefit accrual, otherwise they will lose their fixed protection. And again, there's a percentage associated within that. So as long as the benefit accrual is less than that relevant percentage, then no accrual is deemed to have occurred and they won't lose that protection. And again, we'll pick up on that shortly. All right, so here we are. This is a person who is in a defined benefit scheme. So they're an active member. They've applied for fixed protection 2016. And what happens is you're looking at the increase in their benefits over the period in question. Now, unfortunately, CPI last year was 0%. So in other words, someone who remained an active member of a DB scheme post the 5th of April 2016 and had applied for fixed protection would immediately lose it if they did a pay rise or even a day beyond that, because in theory they've had some benefit accrual there. Now, the pension tax manual gives an example of where someone could, in theory, remain an active member of a DB scheme without losing their fixed protection. But as I've called it, that's very much never, never land. It's too big a risk for people to have taken to remain an active member of a DB scheme whilst being reliant on fixed protection. Okay. So if we ever see another reduction in the lifetime allowance, which I personally can't see happening, anybody who is going to rely on the equivalent of fixed protection really should cease membership of any pension schemes going forward. All right. And again, you can look at these in a bit more detail when you get a copy of the slides, which I believe will either be sent out to you or they will be available on the James Hay website. Right. Very quickly, death in service, we do get questions about whether someone can apply for fixed protection but remain a member of a death in service scheme. It is possible to do that, but it will come down to individual circumstances. Firstly, in terms of how the life cover is structured, and secondly, whether they've remained an active member of the death in service scheme post the 5th of April 2016, for instance. Okay? So you can have clients that have got fixed protection 2014 or 2012, remained a member of the death in service, and they will not lose their fixed protection because the death in service is not deemed to be a benefit accrual. But you just need to be careful what they've done. If they were to join a new employer and join a new death in service scheme, and that death in service scheme was written under pension tax legislation, then it's a new arrangement for that individual, and they would lose their protection as well. Okay. And then we get into another area which you need to think about, permitted transfers and impermissible transfers. I know there's a lot to take on this slide. I'm not going to read it out for you. You could probably read it far quicker than I. But in terms of what is a permitted transfer, transferring money from one, or funds from one money purchase arrangement to another money purchase arrangement is a permitted transfer. Likewise, transferring from a defined benefit scheme to a money purchase arrangement, again, is a permitted transfer. Okay? But you also have these things called impermissible transfers. Okay? And here we have examples of that. You're getting, as I said at the start, very much into the real nitty-gritty of legislation here. Chances of you coming across some of these are few and far between, I would say, for a lot of people, but they do occur. It's more likely it's whether something is a permitted transfer rather than looking at impermissible transfers. Okay. All right, and then the other thing that I alluded to a few minutes ago, I'm way ahead of my time here, is new arrangements. All right, so you have situations where someone wants to establish a new arrangement. Would that result in them losing their fixed protection or their enhanced protection? Well, if someone was transferring from a defined benefit scheme to a money purchase arrangement, as I said a moment ago, that is a permitted transfer, so there wouldn't be an issue here. But in the first example we have here, Jemima, who had fully crystallised her benefits in the past, gets divorced from her husband, and she's entitled to 50% of her ex-husband's pension fund. Problem for Jemima is the only pension she has is that pension that she had fully crystallised the rights to previously. The problem she has is it's not possible under the legislation to mix crystallised and uncrystallised funds. Now, because Jemima is receiving a pension credit, even if her husband had crystallised it previously, from her perspective, it is still an uncrystallised fund until she designates it to drawdown, for instance. So she cannot mix and match the drawdown fund of crystallised and uncrystallised pot. So she would have to establish a new arrangement to take the pension credit. By establishing a new arrangement, the pension credit in itself is not a permitted transfer. She actually would lose her enhanced protection as a result of that. Okay. And then in the latter case, far more straightforward. Jack's got a SIP and he's fully crystallised it, and he wants to transfer from one provider to the other. It's a permitted transfer, so in his case, no loss of protection. So what are the consequences for people who lose their protection? Well, we get back to that little chart that we saw at the beginning of what people could have. So in other words, if someone had enhanced protection and they lost it, but they had dormant primary protection, then they would pick up the dormant primary protection. Likewise, you could have fixed protection 2012, giving you a lifetime allowance of 1.8 million. You lose that because you've had benefit accrual, but you also have individual protection 2014. Then the dormant IP14 comes into being. Now, where someone loses fixed protection, they have to notify HMRC that they've lost that protection, and they've got a certain amount of time to tell HMRC that. Otherwise, there will be potentially penalties involved, and if they don't pay the penalty, then there's an ongoing daily charge above that as well. So it's important that any clients that you have who do things to void any of these forms of protection are made aware of it, and that they have to notify HMRC, and if it's appropriate, in other words, they have certificates, like enhanced protection certificates, they have to return them to HMRC. Then in turn, HMRC would issue a primary protection certificate for them. Okay. Unusually, someone could have a dormant fixed protection 2016, because if you think of the logic of it, most of the time when people have been able to apply for these things, the fixed protection has always been higher than the individual protection, for instance, or enhanced protection higher than primary. With individual protection 2016, someone could have individual protection 14 with a personal lifetime allowance of, say, 1.5, and fixed protection 2016 with a personal lifetime allowance of less than that. Okay, so 1.5 through their individual protection, 1.25 through their fixed protection. So that just means that it's the fixed protection in that instance that's dormant. All right. And if someone loses that, then they potentially go back to just the standard lifetime allowance. All right. So if you lose all your forms of protection, then you're just looking at the standard lifetime allowance for people. And in the case of someone with enhanced protection, if that was all they had and they lost it, and their pension lump sum rights were in excess of 375,000 at the 5th of April 2016, then what they would do is they would revert to scheme-specific lump sum protection. Okay, so they would have a protected lump sum, but they would still be subject to just the standard lifetime allowance. So there are some opportunities involved for people where they have protection and they lose it. And there are some instances where people might actually want to lose the protection to get back to the standard lifetime allowance to, say, for instance, fund a further pension contribution. So here we have one here. This individual has fixed protection in place. So 2012, they took their fixed protection and decided to retire at that point. Okay. And they crystallised 1.2 million of their lifetime allowance. All right, so they used up 80%. They used up 66.6% of the lifetime allowance. But then a few years later, bored with sort of early retirement, they decided to go back to work. And they were paid a salary of 130,000. So just to keep it simple, presume that they stopped taking the income from their drawdown fund. They're not caught by anything on the tapered annual allowance. So this individual has a choice. Because their pension rights were revalued above 1.4 million in April 2014, they could still apply for individual protection 2014, because that is still available up until April of next year. So that would give them or her 1.4 million of a lifetime allowance to work with. And then they could, in theory, then continue to fund a pension and max out on the remainder of their lifetime allowance. So unusual, can happen. Had a couple of advisors who've had clients in that position, and that was the end result that they decided to do, was to revoke the lifetime allowance protection that they had and then go for individual protection 2014 and then put in an extra contribution into the pension. Okay. So in summary, we just quickly looked at the various forms of protection that were available. At the moment, people can still apply, as I said, for individual protection 2014. fixed protection 16 and individual protection 2016. Things that you shouldn't try and do if a client, try and avoid a divorce, as I said. Don't speak to me afterwards about it, not great success rate there. And things like avoiding benefit accrual. It's still possible to remain an active member of a final salary scheme, death in service, or indeed even what you might think is a money purchase, a death in service. So someone that's in an occupational money purchase scheme and has death in service that is, for instance, stipulated as 4 times salary, then although they're in a money purchase scheme or had been for the accrual of their pension rights, because the death in service is a multiple of salary, under the legislation that is actually defined as a defined benefit arrangement, so they can continue to be members of that. And indeed, if someone was a member of a death in service scheme like that, and fear of losing the likes of fixed protection 2016 stopped being a member of the death in service, then it might be possible to reinstate it as long as they haven't had a salary increase. So if they're reinstating it and the death benefits are the same as they were, let's say they were on 100,000 salary, so 4 times that, 400,000. If they reinstate it or become a member again of that scheme and it was still 4 times 100,000, then from what we read within the legislation and the guidance, it's possible to reinstate it without the loss of the fixed protection. However, if the individual had a pay rise to 110,000, then under the way the legislation is worded, that would be deemed to be a benefit accrual and possibly a new arrangement, and therefore they would lose the fixed protection if they became a member of the death in service. And likewise, as I said earlier, if they had moved jobs and then joined a new death in service scheme, then they would lose the protection in place. Any questions? Have I completely dulled you into submission? I think if I had gone to the full 30-odd slides.
No questions? You'll be around for tea, won't you?
Well, you can have a coffee and recuperate, yeah, so I will be around.
You want to see the other slides? Grab Ian during coffee. We're slightly behind time, so let's call it there. Please go and grab him if you want to have him a question.